2045. Europe enters the year everyone feared, but no one planned for. The European Union hasn't collapsed yet, but the machinery holding it together has started to show its flaws. Borders are hardening. Governments are openly defying Brussels. The shared currency is under pressure, and for the first time, leaders aren't asking how to fix the EU. They're asking what happens if it can't be fixed at all. This video is not predicting a collapse. This is mapping out the chain reaction that could follow. What fractures first, what gets replaced next, and how fast the EU starts getting treated like it's optional, then irrelevant. The warning signs have been there for decades, but fixing them is hard because the system only works when everyone follows the same rules, and right now, they don't. The EU is a broad political and economic union, 27 countries working together on laws, trade, and shared rules. There's also the Schengen, which is different. It's the passport-free travel zone inside Europe where most internal border checks are gone. It includes most EU countries, plus a few non-EU ones, like Switzerland and Norway. And it's not a perfect overlap either. Ireland is in the EU, but not the Schengen, while Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein are Schengen, but not in the EU. You still with me? If you want a roadmap, you can start with how an organization handles a crisis, and in Europe's case, the obvious starting point is the borders. For decades, internal borders felt almost invisible. People could come and go. The US grew fast, partly because it functioned like one big open market. But Europe isn't the US, and that's a problem. Enter the Schengen zone. It started small in 1985 with just 5 countries: France, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. But when it became EU law in 1999, it helped turn Europe into one shared space, where people in business could move freely and investors could count on stability. However, Britain and Ireland opted out. That wasn't a coincidence. The troubles in Northern Ireland were still lingering. The Good Friday Agreement, the peace deal that ended decades of conflict, was only a year old. No one knew if it would last. At that time, free movement was a huge security risk. But it was fine for the rest of Europe, until it wasn't. In 2015, Europe's southern border didn't just see a spike, it was overwhelmed. Boats landed non-stop, reception centers filled up, paperwork stopped meaning anything. And along the roads out of Greece and the Balkans, families started moving north in long, desperate lines, on foot, by bus, with whatever they could carry. Many were fleeing Syria. Others came from Iraq, Eritrea, Somalia. Different stories, but with the same goal: don't get stuck at the edge of Europe. On paper, the EU's Dublin III rules said asylum seekers had to stay in the first country they applied in. But that was a loophole. Southern countries took the pressure while the migrants kept moving, aiming for Germany, Sweden, and beyond. Then, one night in Paris changed everything. On November 13th, coordinated terrorist attacks killed 130 people. Hundreds more were injured. French officials confirmed that at least some of the attackers used the migrant crisis to slip through unnoticed. Suddenly, it wasn't just a humanitarian crisis. It was a security crisis, and the moment Europe's trust in its own system started to fracture. So what did France do? It declared a state of emergency. Border controls were back. They were supposed to be temporary, but temporary became the new normal. EU-wide rules started colliding with national politics, and countries began making their own calls. Britain, detached from mainland Europe, watched on. And less than a year later, the UK voted to leave the European Union. And that was just the first vote in a wider political shift that was about to hit the continent. But border pressure doesn't just change policy. It changes who gets elected. Another war breaking out in the Middle East or Africa. Another flood of non-European refugees. A large-scale terror attack or a series of smaller ones increases public suspicion. It all has an effect. The natural response is to demand decisive action, and EU institutions aren't built to move fast under pressure. More hardline Eurosceptics get into national office riding off the back of immigration and security issues. Even the traditional parties get drawn in, much like the government of Sweden. People there got increasingly tired with Sweden's open-door immigration policy. But now the Swedish Democrats are part of Stockholm's governing coalition, something that was unthinkable back in 2015, and they could be a force multiplier in deciding Europe's future. So when politicians say they want to withdraw from Schengen or even the euro, it's not just rhetoric. To understand why the EU struggles to respond, you have to understand how it's built. The European Union doesn't officially describe itself as a confederation, but in practice it shares many of the same features, with some important differences. Basically, Europe's leaders decided they wanted to be like a United States of Europe. But they set up an organization that looks more like the United States as it was under the Articles of Confederation. Critics call this the EU's democratic deficit. In a crisis, the EU can't operate like a country because it simply isn't one, which isn't ideal when a scandal hits and public trust takes another hit with it. A big one was blown open in 2022 when leaked documents alleged that officials in the parliament were taking bribes from the Qataris, and the investigation raised broader concerns about foreign influence efforts. And that's not the only issue that drags the EU down. The euro delivered clear benefits, but not evenly across Europe. It sprang to life on January 1st, 1999, and just 3 years later, it was the official legal currency for all the members of the eurozone. But Britain stayed out. Replacing the pound would mean replacing Queen Elizabeth II's face on their money. But in all seriousness, it wasn't just for vanity. Just look at the charts. Germany did get a pretty big GDP boost. Just take a look at this line versus this one. In 1999, Germany's real GDP per capita was around $26,700. In 2024, it was just under $56,000. Italy, Spain, Greece, they didn't see those kinds of gains. But here's the interesting part. The euro doesn't reflect the health of Germany, but the eurozone as a whole. Germany's economy is typically healthier than the eurozone. That means German goods priced in euros are less expensive than they would be if they were in the old Deutschmark. But the artificially weak currency means more demand for German goods abroad. So the German economy gets to be defined as a trade surplus. Germany's productivity growth improves its national competitiveness. There's also no risk of exchange rate shocks to trade in the eurozone. Single currency, no different currencies to be exchanged. Simple, but other countries don't get that same benefit. In the early 2010s, the so-called PIGS, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, became the face of the eurozone debt crisis. The problem was pretty simple. The eurozone had a shared currency, but not a shared financial system. There was one monetary policy, but no shared balance sheet. These were still separate national economies with separate credit ratings, just locked into the same money. During the boom years, borrowing was cheap and governments took advantage. Then the credit crunch hit, loans got called in, and the weakest economies were expected to pay up fast, just without the tools they used to have. In the past, they could adjust their own monetary policy to absorb the shock. Now they couldn't. They were tied to the same central banking system. Germany and France backed bailouts but demanded austerity in return. They didn't want inflation weakening the currency, and that exposed the North-South divide in a brutal way. It fueled resentment that still hasn't gone away. Germany benefited more from the system, while others paid a higher price during downturns. The results are pretty clear. If you want to park your money somewhere, it makes much more sense to do it in the United States. That means the euro gets weaker, and the EU doesn't get as much tax revenue from the investments. Now, add energy decisions with serious trade-offs to the mix. Europe wanted to lead the move away from fossil fuels, but the transition created new vulnerabilities. Germany shut down its nuclear plants. Russian gas filled the gap until the Ukraine war ripped that plant apart. Electricity prices surged. And Germany, the engine of Europe, got hit the hardest. High power costs dragged down factories and pushed jobs elsewhere. The German economy shrank in 2023 and 2024. At this point, the EU isn't failing because of one crisis, it's failing because every problem compounds with the next one. Energy shocks weaken industry. A weaker economy means less investment. And less investment means Europe falls further behind in the race it can't afford to lose: technology. Of the world's 50 biggest tech companies, only a few of them are European. Meanwhile, the US keeps producing trillion-dollar giants like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. So, Brussels pivots to a different kind of solution: the digital euro. Supporters frame it as convenience. Critics see something else: a system that could expand financial oversight. A digital wallet tied to your identity, where transactions could be tracked more closely, depending on how it's designed. And then proposals like the Savings and Investment Union enter the picture, trying to channel private savings into more investment, a move critics warn could shift risk onto ordinary savers. Because now Euroscepticism doesn't feel theoretical. It feels like a warning sign. Then, the next financial crisis comes, or terrorist attacks strike at the heart of mainland Europe. Even more populist Eurosceptic parties start getting into office. Germany narrowly avoided the alternative for Germany becoming a force in government in 2025. But the trend line is clear, and the next election could bring a bigger shock. The newcomers are either in government or strong enough to force the traditional parties to see things their way. And the EU responds the way it usually does. Not with an election or a major reform, but with another conference. All the while, things get worse. So, one of the countries decides to just ignore the bureaucrats in Brussels and solve its own problems. Maybe it's inspired by Poland and withdraws from the Dublin regulations. That's a big moment, because once a country openly ignores EU asylum law, the question stops being about paperwork and starts being about borders. What's to stop a country withdrawing from the Schengen altogether? At the moment, the likeliest candidate for this is probably Sweden. The Sweden Democrats aren't going anywhere. Maybe it's a terrorist attack. Maybe it's a riot. That's all the Sweden Democrats would need to get more bargaining power. One of their big demands right now: renegotiate Sweden's place in the Schengen agreement. Now, with the crisis and Europe's weakness, they have the clout to do it. And the Schengen reaction gets faster. The EU lacks the true authority to force member states into compulsion. It's not like the US federal government that could raise an army when the South decided to go its own way in 1861. With Sweden's success, other countries that attract migrants decide they don't need to take them either. And while this is happening, Greece and Italy have their own problems. With the economy rocky, they decide to retaliate by withdrawing from the euro. France has shifted further to the right too, and it decides to take the invitation to fix its finances by bringing the franc back. France doesn't leave immediately, but the direction is now obvious. Say another economic downturn lands. National governments are suddenly powerless to provide relief with the right monetary policy. People start to panic and protest, and then it happens. One of the EU members bows to public pressure and leaves the euro. The likeliest candidate for that would be the ones you're pretty familiar with by now: Italy, Spain, or Greece. But there is a possibility elsewhere, a much more damaging one. France has been in chaos lately. The country's debt-to-GDP ratio is 111%. Sure, it's a lot lower than Greece, but about the same as Spain and higher than Portugal's. But that's just the public debt. Add the private sector and household debt, and you get a consolidated debt of 350% of GDP. So now you can see how the dominoes really begin to fall. The people demand a change, and the government caves. France was always the risk. Now it's the breaking point. With France out, there's no way the euro can survive. The chaos escalates. Euro-dominated bonds and assets go absolutely haywire. People don't know what to do, and trade slows to a crawl. The financial crisis gets much worse. For all intents and purposes, the EU stops functioning the way it used to. Global trade is the first victim. The EU is one of America's biggest trading partners. That means it's also the biggest customer for American oil and natural gas. Now, who knows? So American producers have to raise prices on domestic customers to make up the shortfall. That means America's economy slows or shrinks. The EU is China's second largest trading partner, and one they can't afford to lose. A collapse in EU demand would shove it deeper into a recession. At the same time, Russia would see Europe's chaos as an opening, not just to pressure Ukraine again, but to test the Baltics, betting the West won't respond. Back in Europe, that's the nightmare scenario. Economic shock turns into a security vacuum, and suddenly the EU isn't just struggling to stay united, it's struggling to stay safe. So what does Europe do? Well, there's nothing like the threat of invasion for you to get your house in order. So Europe probably finds a way to come together again, just in a different form. Think something like the European Economic Community before the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. Trade zone? Good. Tying everyone together without a democratic mandate and a much more centralized economic policy? Bad. It's a harsh lesson. The European Union wanted to be a United States of Europe, but something was overlooked. The United States of America was new on the world stage, founded in a new world by people who spoke the same language and shared common traditions and experiences. And even creating that was a giant headache. Tying countries with thousands of years of different traditions, cultures, and languages together? Orders of magnitude harder. This is still just a hypothetical. There's a lot to lose if the EU collapses. That usually keeps people around. But there's probably a safe prediction to make. Whatever European institutions there are by the end of the century will be very different from the ones that were there at the beginning.
Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. Really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MatPack.